Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this side event on the role of partnerships in delivering integrated transitions that advance climate, nature, and social outcomes, while ensuring that no one is left behind. My name is Namit Agarwal, and I lead the People Program at the World Benchmarking Alliance. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you, and I would like to thank the permanent missions of Uganda and Colombia, OHCHR, all our speakers, and all participants for joining us today. It is an honor to be organizing this side event together with the UN Special Rapporteur for Right to Development, Professor Surya Deva. Today's discussion comes at an important moment. As countries look to accelerate implementation of the SDGs and the Pact for the Future, there is growing recognition that climate, nature, and social challenges cannot be addressed in isolation. The transition to a low-carbon, nature-positive economy will only succeed if it is also delivering on decent work, it respects human rights, and creates opportunities for workers and communities. That is ultimately what Leave No One Behind means in practice. SDG 17 reminds us that none of this can happen through governments, business, or civil society acting alone. Partnerships are not simply about bringing actors together, they are about aligning ambition, accountability, and action. Today's discussion asks a simple but very important question. How can partnerships help deliver integrated transitions that create benefits across climate, nature, and people? We are fortunate to have an outstanding group of speakers representing governments, the UN system, business, and human rights experts. To help frame today's discussion, it is my pleasure to invite Ms. Claudia Fuentes Julio, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights at the OHCHR. Human rights provide the foundation for ensuring that transitions are inclusive, equitable, and genuinely leave no one behind. ASG Fuentes Julio, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Namit, for the introduction. Good afternoon to everyone, distinguished delegates and friends. It is always a pleasure to join you in this important event. Let me also thank the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, Surya Deva, who is a good friend also of all times in Geneva as well. Also the World Bank Benchmarking Alliance, thank you, and the co-sponsoring permanent missions of Uganda, Colombia, and Kazakhstan for convening this very important discussion. I would like to begin with a little bit of a reflection on an experience of a girl growing up in a village affected by drought. She does not experience climate change, poverty, debt, and inequality as separate crises. She experiences them as one reality. When crops fail, food becomes more expensive. When food becomes more expensive, families pull children out of school. When public budgets come under pressure, health services deteriorate. And when opportunities disappear, hope often disappears with them. For her, these challenges are not divided into sectors, institutions, or mandates. They are connected. And our solutions must be connected too. That is why I believe that this discussion is so important. With less than 5 years remaining, progress across the Sustainable Development Goals remain far off track, while challenges facing people are becoming more and more acute and, of course, more complex. Many countries are struggling with shrinking fiscal space, mounting debt burdens, and growing uncertainty. At the same time, the climate crisis is accelerating. Biodiversity is declining, conflicts are multiplying, and inequalities continue to widen. But let me say that this is not merely a story of constraints. It is also a story on opportunity, which I believe we will hear this afternoon as well. Throughout the world, people continue to demonstrate extraordinary resilience and creativity. We see human rights cities around the world finding new ways to build more inclusive communities. We see young people developing solutions for their own futures. We see business rethinking how value is created. We see communities demanding not charity, but a genuine voice in shaping their own development. The question before us is how we can help turn these efforts into lasting change. This is the reason why the High Commissioner has launched the Global Alliance for Human Rights to bring together states, civil societies, business, cities, youth, and all actors to advance our collective goal of shaping a better future together. This year, as we commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Declaration on the Right to Development, we are reminded of an important idea. Development is not something that is delivered to people. It is something that every person and all peoples have the right to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy. At its heart, the right to development is about human dignity. It asks a simple question: are people able to live lives of freedom? Can they look to the future with confidence rather than fear? Economic growth matters. Investment and technology also matters. But none of these are ends in themselves. They are valuable only if they improve people's lives. And this brings me to partnerships. Too often in this building, the UN, we think about partnerships primarily in terms of financing. Of course, resources matter, and we all know that really matters a lot. But the most successful partnerships are not simply transactions. They are relationships built on trust, shared purpose, and mutual responsibility. The right to development also reminds us that the duty to cooperate lies at the heart of sustainable development. SDG 17 gives practical expression to that duty by recognizing that no country can achieve sustainable development in isolation. Effective cooperation depends on more than the volume of resources mobilized. The quality of partnership matters just as much as their quantity. Partnerships should strengthen national ownership, not weaken it. They should expand each country's policy space to pursue its sound development priorities based on mutual respect. They should expand opportunities, not reinforce inequalities. They should amplify the voices of those who are too often unheard, and they should leave communities stronger than they found them. Friends, today this is it's particularly important as we look to the role of the private sector. Business is already helping shape the future through investment, innovation, technology, and of course employment. The question is not whether business should be involved, but how. How can private investment contribute to decent work, living wages, and stronger communities? How can supply chains become more resilient and fair? How can innovation support both people and the planet? And how can business succeed commercially while also contributing to more inclusive and sustainable societies? Around the world, we are seeing encouraging signs that these objectives are not in conflict. Companies are increasingly recognizing that long-term success depends on respect for human rights. Workers who are respected are more productive. Communities that are inclusive are more resilient. Societies that are fairer are more stable. And economies that respect both human rights and environmental limits are ultimately more sustainable. This captures the essence of a human rights economy that our office has been working to address. The United Nations has a unique role to play in helping bring different actors together, not because we have all the answers, but because we can create the space for government, business, financial institutions, and civil society to come together around a shared vision. A vision grounded in solidarity and international cooperation, a vision grounded in human dignity, fairness, and accountability. Across different regions, we are already seeing how partnerships between governments, business, UN entities, and civil society can improve SDG implementation. We have practical tools to turn this vision into reality, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. For example, my office is actively engaging with a number of tech companies through our B-Tech project that helps companies design responsible AI products and services based on the guiding principles. Ultimately, success of partnerships will not be measured by the resources they mobilize, but by whether they improve the lives of people, particularly those farther behind. As we look to the 27 SDG Summit and discussions on the future 2030 agenda, we have an opportunity to reconnect development with its original purpose. The right to development reminds us that development is not fundamentally about GDP growth, it is about people. It is about expanding freedoms. It is about building societies where every person can contribute and thrive. And it requires solidarity and cooperation, an international order conducive to the realization of human rights and development. If we build partnership on these foundations, SDG 17 can become a powerful catalyst. It will become, we believe, a force for hope, for people and the planet. And hope, perhaps, is the most important resource we will need for the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, ESG, for your remarks and for reminding us that sustainable development and human rights are inseparable and that people must remain at the center of every transition. And also, while there are a lot of constraints, there are also opportunities and hope, which is absolutely important. It is now my pleasure to invite His Excellency Ambassador Godfrey Kyoba, Deputy Permanent Representative of Uganda, for opening remarks.
Excellencies, the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur, the presenters, World Benchmark Alliance, distinguished panelists, distinguished colleagues, and the moderator. It's my honor to speak at this important side event on the sidelines of the high-level political forum. This side event convenes at a time when developing countries continue to face multiple global challenges that undermine national and collective efforts to achieve sustainable development goals and national development aspirations. We are now only a few years away from 2030. Unfortunately, the overall progress in the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, as agreed at the heads of government meeting held at the United Nations September 2015, falls short of the expectations. Developing countries are particularly lagging far behind. Leaving no one behind requires that developing countries must galvanize in demanding that the international community and private sector business entities urgently address the global challenges, in particular poverty, hunger, digital divide, and climate change. Climate vulnerabilities, economic volatility, and social imbalance in the global south, for example, overlap and threaten the realization of the right to development as an inalienable human right. Therefore, enhancing global partnerships is vital. Sustainable Development Goal 17 of partnerships for the goals must be recentered as an operational imperative, actionable, rather than a theoretical aspiration. To deliver on our existing commitments coherently, we call on stakeholders to focus on the following critical dimensions of SDG 17. Number one, reforming capital flows and data architecture. The right to development requires physical space and funding, yet current macroeconomic pressures mean developing nations are forced to choose between servicing debt and investing in climate resilience, health, or education. Under the framework of SDG 17, we must revitalize the global financial architecture to ensure predictable long-term financing. Rather than negotiating new environmental or social pacts, we must accelerate the implementation of the commitments already made under FFD4, Addis Ababa Agenda, and the Paris Agreement, ensuring that resource mobilization directly targets the structural inequalities holding back our populations. Number 2, technology transfer beyond charity. True partnership requires appropriate transfer of technology, particularly digital systems and grid technologies. True development cannot occur if developing nations remain solely consumers of technology rather than active participants in its governance and creation. SDG 17 provides the mandate for systematic technology transfer, capacity building, and digital technical standards that empower local economies. We must operationalize these existing mechanisms to bridge the digital and development divides. 3, policy coherence and institutional alignment. At the national level, for example, Uganda has systematically integrated SDGs into our 4th National Development Plan 4 and our Vision 2040 agenda, ensuring a rights-based approach to growth. However, international partnerships must mirror this coherence. Multilateral agencies, international finance institutions, and bilateral partners must align their interventions behind the respective countries' priorities and strategies rather than introducing fragmented project-based conditions that strain national administrative capacities. 4, tax cooperation is a critical human rights imperative to address illicit financial flows and tax avoidance so that developing countries can mobilize funds for essential public services. As I conclude, the right to development demands a global environment that enables inclusion, economic dignity, and social equity. Proliferating new agendas only fragments our focus and dilutes accountability. Let us use the remaining years of the 2030 Agenda to accelerate the mobilization of financing and execute the commitments already made. SDG 17 remains our most potent tool to transform these fragmented commitments into a unified, coherent reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Your remarks highlighted how it is essential to have an enabling environment for partnerships that deliver across multiple SDGs rather than treating them as separate agendas, and how mobilizing finance and accelerating that is quite an important part of that. And thanks also for your partnership for the side event today. Now, to ground our discussion in evidence, I would like to invite my colleague Charlotte Reeves, who's the multilateral engagement lead from the World Benchmarking Alliance. Charlotte will share some of the latest findings, what they tell us about where progress is happening and where significant gaps remain. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Namit. Yeah. Hello? Yes. All good. Okay, great. Thank you, Namit, and thank you to the distinguished speakers and guests here today. I'll start the presentation with a brief introduction to the World Benchmarking Alliance for those who may not know us. We are a non-profit that assesses the world's 2,000 most influential companies on their contribution to sustainable development. So on the screen, you can see the geographical representation of those companies, as well as their global footprint. So together, these companies account for 47% of global GDP, are responsible for 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and directly employ 107 million people and even more throughout their supply chains. So simply put, how these companies plan, invest, and operate over the coming years will be decisive for whether economic, social, and environmental transitions deliver for planet and people. So if you recognize that business has this level of influence, how do our global agendas reflect that? And we find that increasingly they do. So from the SDGs onwards, it has been recognized that governments cannot deliver sustainable development goals alone. And that is why, obviously, SDG 17 is so important, recognizing global partnerships and the need for a whole of society, whole of economy approach for implementation. And this recognition became even stronger with the adoption of the 2024 Pact for the Future, with Action 55C specifically calling on member states to encourage a contribution and strengthen the accountability of the private sector in implementing UN frameworks. So that is an important shift. It moves the conversation beyond the business's role towards defining how business should contribute to implementation. And importantly, there are existing and emerging examples across UN frameworks and processes. So we are not starting from scratch. Already, the ASG mentioned the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and their importance, but we also see direction through the Paris Agreement, which set a clear, quantifiable target that could be translated for companies to embed into their transition planning and climate strategies. Then, with the Global Biodiversity Framework, not only does it set global ambitions, but through Target 15, it explicitly calls on companies to assess, disclose, and reduce their impacts on biodiversity. Similarly, we are starting to see with the Global Digital Compact that there were specific urges for companies to take action alongside member states. So together, these are starting to build an increasing coherent picture of business responsibility across climate, nature, people, and technology governance. So how are companies performing? So the encouraging news is that we are starting to see genuine progress across several areas. Nearly 1/4 of companies we assess are now aligning their operational emissions with 1.5-degree sector pathways. And on nature, we are increasingly seeing companies assess their impacts and dependencies on nature, with around 2/3 of companies identifying nature risks, and over 40% are taking action to manage those. We're also seeing some improvement on human rights issues. So 4 out of 5 companies operating in high-risk sectors have improved their human rights performance over the last assessment cycle. So this direction of travel is encouraging, but the overall picture is uneven. Companies are often making progress on individual issues while struggling to connect climate, nature, and social outcomes into one integrated transition. And that's where some of the biggest gaps begin to emerge, particularly in understanding how transitions affect people and ensure that no one is left behind. So one of the clearest examples of this gap is with the just transition. So we do see that recognition is growing. For example, around 30% of companies in energy-intensive sectors now reference a just transition, but this is just a first step. And then we found that only 7% of companies engage their own workforce in transition planning. And this is a striking finding because workers are often among those most directly affected by decarbonisation through having to change jobs, new skill requirements, and shifts in local economies. We are, however, seeing examples of leading practice. So Vattenfall, for example, explicitly recognises that the journey to a fossil-free society creates unavoidable trade-offs and that companies need to engage workers, communities, and other affected stakeholders to minimise harms while maximising shared benefits. And we see very similar patterns emerging with AI. So around 39% of major technology companies now publish their ethical AI principles, which has grown over the last few years. However, we don't see any companies that we assess disclose a human rights impact assessment for their AI systems, with Microsoft coming close through an assessment on law enforcement that they did. There is also very weak signalling on the preparedness for the impact of AI on the workforce. So we found that 13% of the companies assessed discuss employment or workforce implication in the context of AI, with 6.5 linking AI adoption to reskilling, and then just one company, the Deutsche Telekom, explicitly acknowledging that AI could displace jobs. As with the climate transition, the challenge isn't simply deploying new technology, it's managing the trade-offs and synergies that come with it. Responsible AI means ensuring that technological progress strengthens people and protects their rights, rather than leaving workers behind. And finally, I'd like to turn to living wages, because this is perhaps the area where business can have the most immediate and direct impact on people's lives. However, we found that fewer than 5% of companies disclose that they pay a living wage or have a credible commitment to do so. One of the most interesting insights from our research is what appears to enable progress. So we found that companies that meet expectations on collective bargaining are 3 times more likely to pay a living wage. And that's a powerful insight because it shows that workers' voice is associated with better outcomes for themselves. We also do see some very strong examples of company leadership extending this beyond their own operations. So Unilever works with suppliers to advance living wage across its value chain, while H&M uses long-term purchasing agreements to reward suppliers that demonstrate good wage practices. So to close that presentation on some of the recent insights from our assessments, I just wanted to say that climate, nature, and social change are deeply interconnected, and so are the solutions. And I feel like even being in sessions this morning, hearing the words interlinkages is kind of one of the main things that we need to do to accelerate SDG implementation. But currently, expectations are still limited by the absence of a shared picture. So we need to move to this more integrated approach to help governments, business, and other stakeholders align action across priority, identify synergies, and manage trade-offs more effectively. And of course, as one of the central messages today, these should be people-centered, as a global transition is not credible if it is not working for people. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. The data gives us both reasons for optimism, but also reasons for urgency. There is growing policy clarity around business responsibility. There is encouraging progress on climate planning and increasing attention to nature. But we also see major gaps when it comes to people and social impact. That brings us to today's central discussion. If integrated transitions are the destination, what partnerships, policies, and accountability mechanisms are needed to get us there? To help us get clarity on how we get there, I have a fantastic panel here. I would like to ask the panelists to keep their opening responses in around 4 minutes or so. We are slightly behind time. And we would also like to keep enough time for a broader discussion today. So, and the broader guiding question for the panel to keep at the back of your thinking is, how can governments, business, and other stakeholders use SDG 17 to promote integrated transitions that deliver co-benefits across climate, nature, and social priorities while ensuring that no one is left behind? To get us started, I would like to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Raul Esteban Sanchez Nino, Deputy Permanent Representative of Colombia to the United Nations. Thank you, Ambassador, for also partnering with us in organizing this session. We know Colombia has been an important voice in advancing more inclusive approaches to sustainable development and has consistently emphasized the social dimensions of climate and development policy. So from your perspective, Ambassador, how can governments use SDGs 17 and international partnerships to ensure that climate and nature transitions also create better outcomes for workers, communities, and those most at risk of being left behind? The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you, Naomi. That's a full question for 4 minutes. Very full question, but I'll try my best to convey a couple of messages. First of all, to thank the Special Rapporteur, the Right to Development, for the invitation, ASG. It's always a pleasure to see you. My colleague from Uganda, my friend, and my colleague from Kazakhstan, and all the partners of this discussion. Thank you for inviting us and to this interesting subject of advancing the private sector's role. Looking at your presentation, Charlotte, and thank you for all the organization that you have done, I was struck by three words: well-being, prosperity, and wealth. Because it's a challenge in today's world to combine those three. Somehow, well-being is leaving no one behind, and that well-being perhaps requires the active engagement of all stakeholders, being those who create, who produce, who bring wealth, who employ people, who pay taxes, also to pitch in and to decisively contribute to societies. But then you go to prosperity, and you say, how can you create that capacity of combining the well-being of people and prosperity in key aspects of government policies? In the case of Colombia, and as also was mentioned by my friend from Uganda, there are structural decisions being taken place from, 50 years ago in having a national development plan and creating in each government a national development plan for 4 years that can envision the way to give development to our country, to create a pathway to shy away from all those poverty statistics that sometimes are used politically or not used in the right way. But then again, we struggle to achieve a purpose when we have it each 4 years. And in the case of Colombia, that is a struggle. So going to your question of how can governments plan ahead is to believe that there are solutions that go beyond those government structural answers and believe in multilateralism. Because the challenge that countries like Colombia or Latin America in general, if I may mention my region, is that development is hindered sometimes by the way governments are chosen, the way businesses are deciding to be part of this development, and also by, unfortunately, the peace and security that we all believe in and has different definitions throughout my region. That is why there are things that have to be combined in order to have this well-being and prosperity, and at the end of the day, talk about wealth. Because that wealth, that machine that keeps giving businesses their purpose and of their profit, it's a challenge when that wealth is not combined with this outermost objective of well-being and prosperity. A couple of examples from Colombia. We organized in 2023 the third Platform 4G Summit, where we tried to combine all these stakeholders, investors, international organizations, NGOs, philanthropists, and academic institutions to deal at length with the climate challenges and paths to enable just transitions, focusing on biodiversity, energy transition, and sustainable cities. Just this semester, last semester now, already July, Colombia organized the first summit about fuel transitions. So we're trying to understand what is our reality as Colombia, a mega biodiverse country, the second largest unequal country in the world, and the fourth largest economy in Latin America. So all these components take me to my message of today, colleagues, is how can we create those partnerships that can help us understand that we are not alone in this common purpose. And the challenge is to understand that the private sector has to have a motive beyond wealth, a motive beyond this profit, and believe that the human component is part of their profit. In the past 4 years, the current government of Colombia has made a strong push of saying life and nature are in the center of our future. So not to extend that long and to respect the 4 minutes, I just want to convey the message, colleagues, that the international community has to comprehend that we need to have a partnership based on the human aspect and a human approach to the implement not only of the SDGs, but the way we interpret SDGs is the approach that public and private partnerships have to understand in order for us to succeed beyond 2030. I thank you, Nami.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I think some very important words there, particularly around the motive of private sector beyond wealth. So thanks for your remarks. If I can move now to another partner and another government, Kazakhstan, and inviting Berzan, who's the chair of Economic Research Institute in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan has been navigating economic transformation while pursuing climate and development objectives. So my question to you is, from a government's perspective, what policies and partnerships have been most effective in aligning economic development with climate, nature, and social priorities? And if you have any examples to share from your experience.
Okay. Well, first and foremost, allow me to thank the organizers for this great side event. I'm really honored to be here today and share my thoughts, although 4 minutes is I think, tall order for me to stack up my 10-page sort of talking points, but I'll try my best. I think the first and fundamental question here, I think I'll try to take a step back and think about this a little more theoretically and then hopefully lay the floor for my points. The first and foremost question, I guess, that we have here is whether government should be involved at all, right? Because a lot of times there's this whole debate about those who are market fundamentalists, and I think Christine will probably talk about the business aspect of those things. And on the other hand, you have the government, right? And where is the territory where the government can actually step in and push the agenda forward, including these sustainable development goals? And I think with that regard, there's one situation specifically that all econ textbooks will probably talk about, and those are the market failures. And when it comes to the market failures, that sort of serves as a justification for the government to step in and try to fix things up, so to speak, or to mold the private sort of incentives, right, and into the public good, so to speak. And I'll try to hopefully sort of go over my, I think, 4 or 5 talking points, specifically surrounded along those lines. And those are, I think, a handful of things. So, I mean, when you talk about private companies, some people might argue that they actually might be ready to invest, right, in green technologies, in energy efficiency, infrastructure, skills, and all that good stuff, right, so to speak. But these investments often depend on other complementary actions, right? And when you don't have the right coordination, individually, it is not beneficial for the private company to engage. And that's the role of the government, I think, in a general sense. And that's how I think Kazakhstan looks at this whole issue, and that's to pretty much, have a clear regulation, sort of try to invest heavily in the public infrastructure, provide fair access to finance, set some clear policy goals, and then the rest somehow will clear up, right? And so Kazakhstan experience sort of suggests that, I mean, it's not just a narrow sort of thought about the cooperation in a narrow sense, but it's more of a framework on how to organize these developmental policy. And with that perspective, I think here we've approached this through all these 4 or 5 sort of policy dimensions. The first one is institutional coordination. The second is sustainable financing. Third is territorial development. And the last is this climate transition. So the first lesson, I think, from Kazakhstan's experience is, of course, anything requires an institutions, right? And Kazakhstan has established a national institutional architecture for SDG implementation. So this includes a handful of things. The first one is SDG Coordination Council, as per the coordination failures, I guess, chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister. And the second one is SDG Implementation Monitoring Committee. And then we have the Parliamentary Commission. So as the Economic Research Institute, we actually serve as a secretariat for the Coordination Council and the Monitoring Committee, and we try to provide expert support and analytical support for both of these bodies. So this architecture, I think, is important because SDG goals cannot be delivered by just one ministry or one private company or one sector alone. So, I mean, climate, for example, policy involves energy, industry, logistics, infrastructure, agriculture, regional development, and so on and so forth. The social policy involves education, healthcare sector, labor markets, right? And so all of these things are not just one standalone items. It needs to be delivered by wholesomely by all of them combined. So the first role of the government is to first create the platforms where these policies can be coordinated. The second one is, and I'll probably skip on this because I have only 4 or 3 minutes left, is that SDGs must be linked to planning and finance. And I'll talk about this in conjunction with my next item, which specifically is the infrastructure. And I guess this has to do with the territorial development of a big country. Kazakhstan is a big country, and so are many other countries that are around the table here. And so how to make sure that every single region is not left behind, so to speak, right, as per the example that was set forth by the first opening remarks. And with this regard, Kazakhstan has actually launched what is called a system of regional standards. Okay, so this is a basic system that will define the list of social, engineering, transport, all of these infrastructural items that should be available to the citizens for urban or rural, depending on where they live. And not only that, once you define the list of items that has to be there, what you try to do next is to tie this to the budget system, right? So that whenever the budget is distributed within the country, it actually goes to the regions that actually need that. And not just that, right? You actually target specifically all of these 12 items, and you can look at them, which of them are in the red territory, so to speak, and target those specifically. Because a lot of times what usually happens in the developing countries is you have one strong, for example, mayor who is lobbying, right, the government hard for funds, and he's building a second pool, whereas maybe at the same time that region lacks the roads, right, or some, I don't know, schooling, or the health, for example, infrastructure. So to avoid all these complexities, of course, you need to put this in a data-driven solution, which we now have, and Surya enjoyed our presentation, I hope, back when he visited our country. So basically, you tie these public funds to the specific data-driven solutions, right, such as the system of regional standards. Now, what we didn't show, Surya, last time was that we actually went a little further now and now try to build this regional well-being index. And it sort of goes beyond as to what I think objective numbers will sometimes show, because the growth is sometimes not objective, but subjective, right? Even if you have the roads, all the public infrastructure, sometimes people might still be unhappy about certain things. And to capture that aspect, we've developed this regional well-being index with the help of Asian Development Bank through their knowledge and experience exchange program. So this is basically another sort of instrument, the survey that actually captures this subjective aspect of the regional development. And the last item, I think, is, of course, the transition to the climate transition that I was going to talk about, but I probably depleted all my 4 minutes of time, so I'm just going to draw down to the conclusion section. So I guess the first thing is, again, to address these coordination failures, the first thing you need is the platform to coordinate all the stakeholders, right? The government, the private sector, the civil society. Then, of course, you need to have some objective and subjective indicators. I think they'll be driving the agenda forward and try to drive the whole public and private sectors in a sort of directed channel. And then, of course, I mean, I mentioned the data-driven as if it's a given. Sometimes you don't have that, right? So it's a huge challenge in a lot of developing countries to even collect this data to begin with. And they're setting the right targets and the climate targets, including maybe connect them to the industrial policy, labor market policy, sort of capacity building, and all that is also of major sort of action items that I think might have popped up here. And I think what I would like to mention in my concluding remarks is that, of course, I stand ready to continue sharing our experience, but of course, as well as to learn from our esteemed partners. So thank you.
Thank you, Birzan. I think you talked about some really important ingredients of what it takes. And I know 4 minutes is quite short, but the idea was to also make it more interactive. And I hope when we open it up, you will get more chance to talk about some of those. And with that, if I can bring the private sector voice in with Kirsten Edgren Kaufman, who's the Senior Vice President of Global Impact Initiatives at US CIB. And Kirsten, business is increasingly recognized as a critical partner in delivering the SDGs. We have seen a lot of excitement since 2015. And if I can get your perspectives on how governments and multilateral processes engage companies in a way that move beyond compliance and encourage integrated approaches that deliver for climate, nature, and people simultaneously.
Thank you to the World Benchmarking Alliance for convening this very special meeting, and to the missions of Uganda, Colombia, and Kazakhstan as well, and to Mr. Deva. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but thank you very much. So regarding the question I've been asked, my answer in short is to engage us as partners in design, not audiences for outcomes. So I'd like to talk about what this looks like, starting with why business is really central to this agenda. My organization, the United States Council for International Business, is the official U.S. private sector representative in the United Nations ECOSOC, as well as other multilateral bodies such as the ILO, the OECD, the World Trade Organization, and some others. And the private sector is really committed to integrated energy transition approaches. We play a central role in pursuing global climate goals by driving innovation and mobilizing resources, especially in the sectors that are most directly impacted by the transition to cleaner energy sources. But commitment alone doesn't produce integration. Integration really, as you mentioned, requires a mechanism. And that mechanism for us already exists, social dialogue. Bringing employers and workers together is really essential for us. A practical and effective just transition requires policies that are grounded in business realities. A lot of times, governments implement policies in a silo without understanding some of the unintended consequences. So that means meaningful inclusion of businesses from all sectors in these discussions, not for a consultation after the fact. For us, the International Labor Organization, or the ILO, remains the appropriate multilateral forum, given its legal mandate to lead discussions on labor and skills in this context. So the social dialogue is the how of how we integrate, but skills are where the integration becomes real. And nothing connects climate ambition to social outcome more directly than the question of who will do these 18 million new jobs, which is what the ILO estimates will be created by the energy transition before 2030. And skilling for us is really where climate and social objectives meet. And to your point of whose responsibility is it, government or private sector, we think it's shared. We need public policies that really address these gaps in education, gender equity, and youth participation. Effective skill-building strategies for us combine three contributions. One, government-led initiatives, and that could be robust technical and vocational education and training systems, public-private partnerships, quality apprenticeships, lifelong learning policies, and gender-sensitive training programs. If you look here in New York City and state, they were building out about an 800 million offshore wind farm, and the government made it a rule in order for companies to bid, they would have to agree to partner with local vocational institutes, local high schools, so that communities that were traditionally left behind in transitions wouldn't be. I think that's one effective example. Secondly, employer contributions, and that could be on-the-job training, industry academic collaborations. Someone mentioned Microsoft. Google's another good example. They have an AI Essentials course, and they've trained over 100 million people globally with AI and digital skills. Another program they did, they launched in 2023, that's used by educators in 130 countries. They've reached 2 million students. It's called Experience AI, and again, an educational program for upskilling. So those are two examples there. And then the last thing is worker engagement. Workers and unions really have to buy in upskilling and embracing technological advancements. There is a fear that all these jobs are going to be displaced. In some cases, that's true. So we really need the workers to be a part of helping with the retraining process. So what does that mean concretely for member states and global processes? For us, there's 4 practical solutions. First, embed just transition considerations in national climate instruments. One avenue is to encourage countries to better reflect just transition considerations when they implement their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, under the Paris Agreement, while fully respecting the nationally determined nature of NDCs. Today, only 38% of NDCs reflect just transition principles. Second, provide an enabling environment. Businesses need stable and affordable energy prices, clear and supportive regulatory frameworks, and effective incentives to foster competitiveness and innovation. So we'd really like a smart mix of balanced measures that really unlock enterprise potential, that encourage the adoption of clean technologies, a transition to low-carbon production processes, and workforce upskilling and reskilling. But we don't want to see a fragmentation of all these different regulations in different bodies that end up hurting innovation that can provide solutions for climate challenges. And then support employers to transition. We want financial support, tax incentives, and infrastructure investment, which are critical to enabling employers to adopt green technologies and remain competitive. And we feel strongly that government should also tackle informality, excessive bureaucracy, and corruption. And then lastly, for global processes like the ILO, focus on knowledge sharing, capacity building, and technical assistance instead of binding standards that may not suit diverse national contexts. One size fits all is not what works in Colombia might not work in the United States, and vice versa. And we really feel strongly, since I'm getting close to the 4 minutes, that none of these avenues work if any one actor tries to do it alone. Government alone can't solve these issues. Business alone can't solve it. So each of us has a really distinct role. Again, employers should invest in workforce development and green innovation. Government should lead with comprehensive policy frameworks that emphasize education, training, and sustainability. And workers should be proactive in upskilling and participating in lifelong learning. So a lot of our companies' upskilling initiatives show what businesses can deliver, but in sectors or contexts where displacement occurs, governments should have robust, active labor market policies in place to ensure that workers stay in the workforce and ensure new opportunities. We feel that governments should actively monitor the labor market, direct public resources where they're needed, and promote an enabling environment for innovation and entrepreneurship. And that partnership, business execution plus government policy, for us is what SDG 17 is all about. So thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, for underscoring that it's a shared responsibility between governments and the private sector, and also highlighting that it's important to have the private sector as partners in design. Extending that conversation, if I can now invite Tolu Lewis Tamoka, who's the Chief of Government and UN Relations for the UN Global Compact. Tolu, the UN Global Compact has recently developed recommendations on strengthening UN business collaboration, particularly under the Pact for the Future. From your perspective, what needs to change, both from governments and from businesses, because you work across both of those, so that it helps to move from partnerships in principle to partnerships that actually deliver measurable outcomes?
Thank you. Thanks for having the UN Global Compact be part of this discussion this afternoon. I also wanted to extend our appreciation to the entire organizers of this event, the World Benchmarking Alliance, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the mission of Uganda, Colombia, and Kazakhstan. This is a really important session, and I like the way we have, sort of built on each other in terms of responding to the respective questions. And I wanted to share some perspective of how we, as the UN Global Compact, have worked with government, but also with the business to enhance and accelerate implementation of the pact. Charlotte mentioned this in the presentation. Thank you so much. But also for working with our team in putting together these recommendations that we're going to be launching very soon around how we are implementing the Action 55C of the Pact for the Future. But before I go into the Pact for the Future, I know we've had some really good examples of country-level work. So I wanted to also share some perspectives from our work as the UN Global Compact. As we all know, whatever we're able to achieve here at the UN, either in New York, in Geneva, or other key UN processes, truly depends on a strong and constructive relationships between the UN, governments, business, and other key stakeholders at national level, but also at global levels, in turning the ambitions of the SDGs into meaningful action and progress. And for us as the UN Global Compact, and for those who don't know us, we are the world's largest sustainability initiative with over 25,000 participants in our membership, presence spanning 160 countries and 60-plus country networks that support impact at national level and in delivering on the ground. In terms of our 10 principles, which is really at the center of what we do, we cover human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. Lots of the key themes that have also been discussed this afternoon. So for us, our work is very much driven by a strong focus on multi-stakeholder relationship building and collaboration. As I said, this could be at country level, but also globally. So allow me to first start by sharing 3 examples of how we work as the Global Compact at country level to strengthen business engagement in support of the SDGs and the Pact. I'd like to spotlight 3 examples from 3 different regions. The first in Africa, which is our work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where our country network is collaborating with the government of Kinshasa in an urban environmental governance initiative that brings together the public sector, business, and the UN around a shared set of local priorities. In Latin America, our country networks and the resident coordinator in Uruguay engages with the government partners on how they're working closely together to align business engagements with the National Sustainability Development Agenda, which is within the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, providing a common platform that collaboration and helping to restructure the country network's engagement with local companies on issues of shared interest and concern. So working closely with the resident coordinator on the ground, but bringing in the voice of business into how the UN can support governments to achieve its National Sustainable Development Agenda is what we do as an example from our work in Latin America. In Europe, we recently partnered with the EU Parliament to convene 54 sustainability officers from companies with a combined market capitalization of nearly 1 trillion euros to discuss sustainability leadership and to translate the evolving EU regulatory environment into practical collective action. These examples reflect the model that the Global Compact has been advancing through its role as coordinator of Action 55C, and I come to the second part of my contribution this afternoon. The task team is convened by the Secretary General as part of the Pact for the Future implementation, and we're pleased to have also the World Benchmarking Alliance as part of the task team also contributing, and thanks to Charlotte for your inputs there. To what is work we were about to finalize that looks at ways in which we can bring together our work around working with governments, working with the UN to advance the Pact. This task team, I must say, brings together a diverse group of UN, business, standards, and investor organizations, and they've spent several months examining the barriers and the opportunities for more effective business UN collaboration. We'll be sharing the findings of a full report, the work of the task team, next week at the SDG Business Forum on the 14th of July. And also in a dedicated dialogue, which we'll be having with member states at the UN Global Compact office here in New York on the 16th of July. But allow me to share a little bit of a sneak peek into the findings from the report this afternoon. The report highlights some key opportunities and challenges, if I may. One is that the barrier to strengthen collaboration between governments and business are both structural and operational, but not motivational. Both business and the UN system are seeking to engage more effectively. What is limiting progress is fragmentation across entry points, misalignment in timelines, and a lack of systematic approaches for bringing businesses into the design of frameworks where contribution matters most. The evidence from our consultations and from the experiences of our country networks on the ground points to a consistent pattern. When business is meaningfully and consistently engaged in the design and negotiation of international frameworks, and those frameworks include a clear articulation of what governments expect from the private sector, the conditions for stronger private sector action and sustainability performance are in place. Companies invest more genuinely in advancing shared goals when they have a real role in defining them. That, in essence, is the underlining message from the task team's report that informs our more detailed proposals and recommendations, which, as I said, we'll be showcasing next week. I would like to encourage you all to join our SDG Business Forum, where you can learn more and really deep dive into the recommendations from this report. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all this afternoon, but at our upcoming events as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing a sneak peek of the report, and we will all eagerly wait to looking at the report as it comes out next week. If we can expand this dialogue a little further and bring others in, and I hope we also get some more time for all my panelists to be able to bring some other points in this last segment. So now it is time to get some reflections from the floor or questions to the panelists. If you can just indicate if you want to come in with your reflections. And while you speak, if you can also just give a quick introduction of which organization are you representing. Yeah, I see a hand here. Yeah, you want to?
Thank you. My name is Thalita. I am a public defender for São Paulo, and I am with the Brazilian delegation. So my question is for the panel, and especially for the Assistant Secretary General on consent, and for the business side on financiers. Weeks ago, I was at the Regional Forum on Business and Human Rights in the Panama City, and the private sector was, to my eyes, notably underrepresented. I read that as one symptom of a broader retreat, as companies like BlackRock, JP Morgan, and others step back from the climate coalitions. So does the willingness to sit on the table when engagement is voluntary, so is showing up. So how can benchmarks such as WBAs and the SDG 17 review measure the quality of participation and consent and the due diligence of financiers? The working groups on business and human rights recent guidance on free, prior, and informed consent expects investors to hold proof of consent throughout an investment's life. So without accountability reaching the financiers, even transitions we call green risk reproducing what indigenous people themselves name as green colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Maybe we can take a couple of questions, reflections, and then come back to the panel. If there are other questions or comments, please feel free to just indicate. Okay, while I hope people are thinking of the questions, if I can turn back to the panel, the question around underrepresentation of private sector, particularly in the forum that was mentioned. If I see, Kristen, you are eagerly waiting to answer on that.
Disclosure, I was supposed to have been there, but I had a travel conflict for another work trip, so I'm feeling guilty when you say that. But for a lot of our members, and again, we represent 300 Fortune 500 companies here from the US, as well as some European companies as well, the business and human rights angle is just as important as it was before. They're not changing their policies at all, regardless of these changes in administration. And then separately, on the voluntary nature not being as effective, I think I disagree with that. I think businesses tend to view that in a way that's better for innovation, better for encouraging growth. It's been very effective, maybe not necessarily at BHR, sense, but a lot of people are adhering to these policies. I don't think making something binding is going to make it better. Something prescriptive tends not to be helpful. If you look at some of in the case of, I think it was it Colombian coffee, or it was somewhere in Latin America, there was all these prescriptive agreements that people had to adhere to, and it ended up putting a lot of small entrepreneurs out of business because they couldn't afford to pay for all these regulatory requirements. And so who does that benefit? A lot of the big U.S. multinationals. So I think we have to be careful in terms of unintended consequences.
Thank you. Yeah, Ambassador.
Just a quick reaction about your question, and it brings to my mind how is social responsibility programs in private sector now defined? Where are you getting the information on what is social responsibility in 2026? Because so many big companies have these areas of social responsibility, and that has shaped and turned into many things at the same time. So it's very important that the private sector nurtures from government, from NGOs, to get that social responsibility role updated, to create the proper bridges with society, so they can interpret how they can contribute on an equal basis, on an updated basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Tolu?
Yes. So on the issue of the retreat or not of the private sector, in my experience, what I have been seeing is actually the private sector is quite engaged, and I think is engaging more and more. Maybe not at the level that we wish. We always want, even more. But I actually, what I see is quite a lot of engagement. I see that in the Business and Human Rights Forum every year is one of the most popular ones. Actually in Geneva, where you really see so much interest from the private sector in terms of in terms of knowing more about corporate responsibility, knowing more about what it means to have a human rights framework when doing business. I think in general it's encouraging, but certainly there are many more avenues that we should open, of course. I think that's one. For example, we recently launched the Global Alliance for Human Rights, and one of the main panelists was the head of the IOE, of the employers of the major international alliance for employers, and he was actually speaking, really frankly about how much interest there is from the private sector on, trying to engage more on this. But there was a second part of your question that I'm not sure I quite got, which relates to green colonialism. That's correct? Which I am assuming you're referring to basically that there are important sectors of the population that are left behind. That is to say, indigenous populations, the issues related to land, for example, extractivism, and so on. Afro-descendant communities that also tends to suffer sometimes more from underdevelopment. Yes, those are issues that we, from a human rights perspective, tackle, and those are issues that we should be engaging more, of course, with the private sectors as well, in terms of who is affected more from economic growth and why there are so many inequalities that persist around the world and across regions and inside each one of our nation states as well. I think those are very important questions. And at the core of that is the increasing amount of inequalities that are so much persistent in our societies, and that we need to work together with government, private sectors, certainly at the multilateral level, to see how we really can tackle this problem, because it's not going away. Countries tend to be more unequal. I was surprised that you were saying that Colombia is the second most unequal country in the world. I wasn't Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. I know that my region is one of the most unequals in the world, which is our region, which is Latin America, but I wasn't sure that Colombia is actually the second. So those remain the biggest political challenges, in my view, of the future, is how can we make our societies more equal? And that certainly it's an important challenge, and we rely much more than before, I think, on the private sector, because they're stronger than they were, 50 years ago in terms of what they do and what they cannot do. So yes, it's a very important question.
Yeah, thank you. Tolu, you wanted to come in?
I wanted to compliment ASG and also Christine on the fact that businesses are still, engaged, involved in business and human rights. And we are also seeing this on a regional level, an increase in involvement also from a regional perspective, which is closer to them and, where their footprints are. And also in terms of your question around reporting, we know that they're still engaged because of our reporting platform. We're a voluntary initiative as the UN Global Compact, but we have what we call the communication on progress, where we're able to hear from businesses as to how they are advancing on some of these priorities. And in terms of the reporting rate, it's still very high. 92% of businesses are still responding, and sharing updates on how they are advancing on human rights, on different aspects of their engagement to advancing sustainable development goals in the environmental area or in advancing gender equality. So in terms of the reporting rate, it's still very high in terms of, how they are contributing to these goals. Of course, they could do more, but they're still very much seized on these issues.
Thank you, and Kristen. And maybe we can also have another reflection. So if anybody has a question, please be ready with that. Kristen?
Because there's been a lot of talk about the business retreat from the Sustainable Development Goals or government's retreat. Our businesses are just as committed. We're not referring to them. The language has changed. It's a semantics issue. We're not referring to SDG number, which has become kind of symbolic of bureaucracy at this point, and it's sensitive with this current U.S. administration. But what's inside the SDGs, the actual content, our businesses are just as focused on. They're just as dedicated to. It's just a change in semantics. My title used to be Senior Vice President of Sustainability. Now it's Global Impact Initiative. It's the same exact work. It's just a change of semantics, and we're seeing that across our companies. Many of them have changed their titles. They're just as committed to the work, though. It is what it is.
Thank you for that. I don't see any hands for questions or reflection. Maybe I can also quickly respond to one of the questions around benchmarks and whether benchmarks can measure quality of participation. I think benchmarks are a tool, and I think the idea is to accelerate disclosures and transparency of what companies are doing. In the presentation that Charlotte showed, we have seen progress, particularly when companies are committing and having the mechanisms in place. But we still see a lot of room for improvement when it comes to actual outcomes and performance. And perhaps there is a lot that is happening, but we are yet to see more disclosures on that front. So that is definitely an area where we as WBA are trying to engage with a lot of companies and other stakeholders to make sure that we have more disclosures around performance and actual outcomes of what companies are doing. If I can now, because I promised that there might be more time for you to share some additional thoughts. So if I can give maybe a minute to each of my panelists for some closing remarks based on what you've heard other panelists speak. And again, if I can start with you, Ambassador Sanchez-Nino, just a minute of any closing remarks that you might have.
Thank you. Quick minute. 3 messages. One, inequality is a huge issue, and it must be in the center of all decisions that we need to do with the private sector. The second message is that the change of semantics is difficult for when you are in a multilateral environment. But I'm very encouraged on your words that the message and the substance is still there from the private sector. And third, again, as part of my message, multilateralism is the answer to create those bridges, and we need to salvage those bridges with multilateralism and with a strong dialogue, as most of them I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Barzan?
Yes, I think I have a couple of points. I think first to the question or / comment. From Kazakhstan, I believe we have 111 companies that are actually participants in the UL Global Compact, as an example. ESG, for example, approaches are also increasingly becoming sort of a national investment policy. So all of these things are still high up on the list of private sector companies. And I think these developments are quite important because they usually help to align private sector incentives with the national sustainable development goals. So I think with that, I have a couple of sort of notes here. First is that I think government can and should serve as a coordination platform that brings together different stakeholders. Second, and that SDG indicators should be integrated into the national planning and public investment initiatives and decisions. Third is that public finance should be used strategically, and they should be used to mobilize the private capital, right? So when there's a risk, for example, huge involved duration risk, so they could partially cover up those and still mobilize or invite private stakeholders to participate. And the fourth, I think, regional territorial standards are essential for ensuring that transitions are inclusive, including the topics of inequality, for example. We take that topic very seriously. And in fact, at the ERI, we have now a huge initiative that actually takes a deep dive into these issues, not just sort of macro indicators such as Gini or Palma, for example, but actually trying to dig dive into the regional aspects, into the individual characteristics and different factors that might actually potentially influence the inequalities at the small regional levels. Fifth is that the climate targets must be, I think, connected to the industrial policy and several different other initiatives as well. And lastly, I think there's a voluntary national reviews, right? They should actually be treated not only as a reporting exercise, but as the platforms for dialogue, accountability, and partnership building. Thank you.
Thank you. Kirsten, any last remarks from you?
Appropriate that we're here in the UN, that the multilateral institutions are key as this, as you said, is a convening space for all these different parties to meet so that countries don't have, especially for the exchange of best practices, what models are working, what are the concrete, you mentioned some of the concrete public-private partnerships, and to learn from each other's failures as well, and then to be able to adapt those to their own national circumstances. And I think it's really important that when you look at those convenings, you bring as diverse a group from the private sector as possible. This might not be popular to say here, but including fossil fuel companies. The wave of the future is in green energy. That's where all the investment dollars are going, including Exxon, Shell. Most of their new money is in investments are going towards the green transition, towards new technologies, and they're going to have a lot of solutions as well. So I think it's important that we bring as many people to the table as possible. And some of our Kazakh oil friends might have solutions too.
Thank you. Closing remarks from you, Tolu?
Yes, 3 points from my end. One is I think we all established this afternoon that there's a spirit of shared responsibility between governments and businesses. Of course, there are challenges in terms of some of the structural operational barriers, which our report also highlights. And these need to be tackled, and we can share more when we launch our reports on what these are and how they can be addressed. And we look forward to working with governments and also businesses to unpack some of these challenges. And we just heard from some of our businesses in Spain where, to your point, the language has changed, but not the strategy. It still remains front and center to business. And two other points they highlighted was sustainability. It's not a cost, it's an investment. So businesses see sustainability as a proof point for their long-term strategic priorities and for them to be there for the long haul. And also resilience is an added word that we hear more often now from businesses. because resilience is the added value of sustainability. And those businesses that are resilient, they also reap the benefits of sustainability in the long term.
Thank you so much. Thanking all my panelists for those comments. We have the last 5 minutes remaining, and if I can now turn to our co-organizer, co-host, Professor Suryadeva, UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Development, for your closing remarks.
Thank you, Namit. At the outset, I'd like to thank all the speakers and panelists for finding time for this conversation, and also the permanent missions of Colombia, Kazakhstan, and Uganda for agreeing to co-sponsor this event. As Virjan mentioned, I did a country visit to Kazakhstan, and tonight I'm going to Colombia. So 2 countries covered. Uganda is left, so I need to go to Uganda as well next year. So, but let me start with an observation about the debate that I still see. I've been working in the space of business and human rights for 25 years now, and I still hear the same debate between voluntary versus obligatory. And I think we need to get more nuanced. It's not either or. Civil society asking for mandatory, businesses saying, oh no, we don't need mandatory. If we don't need mandatory, can we totally remove taxation laws? Businesses can pay tax as they wish, voluntarily. So, I mean, we need to understand the value of binding obligations and the voluntary. Binding obligations cannot be the roof. Binding obligations are not ambitious ever. Binding obligations provide a starting point, and voluntary responsibilities complement them. So I hope we can start moving beyond these debates that have been going on for decades. That's one point I wanted to make. But let me come to the focus of this conversation. And let me start with leave no one behind, and a lot of pertinent remarks made by the speakers and panelists about the inequalities. And I'd like to mention 3 C's here, which are disrupting the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals, including the principle of leave no one behind. Climate change, conflicts, we have not talked about enough about conflicts, and the civic space, I will say. And I think the 4th C is corporations. I mean, of course, we talk about businesses, but ultimately in many situations, when we say businesses, we are referring to companies or corporations. In my view, businesses have a key role to play in all these 3 C's: conflicts, civic space, and climate change. They can definitely be part of the solution. They are not part of the solutions as of now. If they were, we would not be in this room. Let us be honest. Many businesses are leading, but a majority of businesses are not really doing what they're claiming they should be doing, or they're not fulfilling their responsibilities. We need a course correction. And I think the reference made that can businesses think beyond profit logic? That was a very powerful point made. And that's where I believe right to development provides a holistic framework. Often we think of right to development as merely about economic growth or economic development, but that is only part of the story. It's about political, social, cultural, and economic development. And here in this session, we're talking about integration. So if you look at right to development, it integrates all these dimensions. And let me highlight 4 points, and I will wrap up with those, which are the aspects of right to development and how we can build on these. First is fair distribution. Right to development demands that the benefits of economic development should be fairly distributed. Are they fairly distributed? If you look at the data, 12 men, and I'm consciously using the word men because they are men, have as much wealth in the world as the poorest 4 billion people in the world. 1 point. 2.2 billion people in today's world do not have access to internet at this point of time in 2026. And we are talking about unequal distribution. So let's talk about the cocoa farmers in Africa. They remain poor. Chocolate companies are getting richer. The garment workers remain poor, and the t-shirt companies and the clothing companies are making a lot of profit. So I think we need to really reflect on the fair distribution. And that's where the question of living wage matters, but it's a question of how do we share the profit equally? The countries that have natural resources in the global south, and now there's a rush for critical minerals, they do not get the fair share of those resources. Rather, the resources are benefiting someone else. That's where the green colonialism narrative comes into picture. So I think we really need to reflect hard those particular questions. Second is intergenerational equity. Right to Development talks about intergenerational equity, and that's where the future generations become relevant. Businesses talk about consultation, but they are talking about consultation with the present generation. But all of us are selfish, me included. So how could we leverage businesses to think beyond the present generations? How could the trustees of future generations be consulted and part of these conversations that we're having here? That is very crucial. The third element is active, free, and meaningful participation. So active, free, and meaningful. And Kristen, you made a very good point that businesses would like to be parties in design, right? But I would like businesses to do the same to communities. Because often governments and businesses are consulting communities after decisions have been made in principle. And that is not participation. So I think we need to apply the principle of participation at all levels. The governments should meaningfully engage private sector, and the private sector should meaningfully engage communities by the same token. And finally, international cooperation. I think multilateralism is very clear. We need to work together. International cooperation often is seen in relation to states and states cooperating. But I would suggest that this principle is relevant for the private sector as well. And that's where partnerships between companies in different regions of the world are very crucial. Peer learning, sharing good practices, capacity building. So international cooperation should be seen business to business as well, not merely state to state. And I very much hope that out of this conversation, we can start thinking about what are the entry points to leverage these partnerships towards the common goal. Because if we share the common vision, where we want to be for the present generation, for the future generations, then there is no alternative but for us to work together. And working together is difficult, it's challenging. We disagree. We may not always agree on where we wish to go, but there is no alternative to cooperation and partnerships. So thank you everyone for these conversations, and I pass it on back to Namit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Surya, for those remarks and also for challenging all of us. With that, we are at the end of the session. I really want to thank the permanent missions of Uganda, Colombia, Kazakhstan, ASG, all my panelists, and everyone in this room for joining us today. The idea of this discussion was to not to end the conversation, but to begin and see how we can continue building on these conversations in the future. So thank you everyone for joining us today.